Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on football. And there's very few reasons why I'm ever dressed up and sitting here in my home office. But obviously, for the reason today was because we were just over off of I-75 at Arthur Blank's press conference, his end of the year press conference, in which he discussed a myriad of topics, which is what the show is going to be about. Kind of go through basically what was covered over the course of this 35-ish minute press conference, which is probably a little bit less than what a lot of you would have hoped for to be able to hear from Arthur Blank. There was certainly some things that were not able to be asked. I think it's also with where the Falcons are in terms of everything that they're doing right now at this stage with hiring the president of football and then the GM and head coach to follow. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked and answered by Arthur Blank and some of these other individuals who later get hired. But there will be more time for that. I've been told that, and this is obvious, but we will hear from Arthur Blank again this winter, and I would assume that will come after the president of football is hired. I would imagine then we see a joint press conference between those two individuals, and from there on, I would imagine that then the press conferences are handled by that president of football, and we'll talk about why that will be the case later on in the show. But for what today was, it was basically, by the way, guys, this was the league mandated end of season press conference that every team is required to do within a certain period of time. That's conducted by either the GM, the head coach, or the owner. And in the Falcons case, they do not have a GM or head coach. Or I think president's also on that list. There's like several titles that it could be. And obviously, they're not going to put Greg Beadles out there. By the way, it just goes to show, if anybody was thinking like, oh, is Greg Beadles going to have, football say now that his title has been elevated? They've added CEO to his title. I think the fact that he was not at the press conference today, answering questions shows that, I like Greg a lot. And so I just want to say, it just because it shows what his role is, which is not focused on the day-to-day football stuff, the passing and throwing and running and tackling and blocking of it all. He does other things that are important for the club, but not necessarily a person who needs to be responding to questions about the football team. That is, of course, Arthur Blank, the team owner. And so we will get into what was discussed today, and I've got a list of some topics. I think that I was a little bit surprised. I was actually told just before the press conference started that I was going to be asking one of the opening questions, and so I think I actually repeated Mark's question basically a little bit right off the top, but we did get an interesting response from Arthur Blank in regards to, I'll just say my question in particular, because that's one I was focused on. When I heard I was second in the question asking right off the top of the press conference, at which point I totally ignored Mark. He can ask whatever the hell question he wants, and I frankly wasn't even paying too close attention to the actual answer, just kind of getting ready for my question to be asked. But anyways, it was ultimately about, why did you fire Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot? And, I thought what Arthur Blank had to say was pretty sharp. And I think that it was a bit of a different, just like on that sharpness angle, I think that it was a bit of a different type of, I guess, atmosphere, but I think a different mentality or a different kind of feeling that I was left with after the press conference concluded from Arthur Blank, as opposed to the press conference that he did, the only other one that I've been a part of, in which he conducted it here at the end of the season, which was after they fired Arthur Smith in 2023, where, that press conference, he obviously had Rich McKay sitting there at the table, and there was a lot of, questions flying at them that were pretty aggressive and, valid, obviously. These are questions that needed answers to, but it felt like, because Terry Fontenot kept his job at that time, so it felt like they were trying to, just kind of, you're trying to triangulate and try to basically describe why you made this move, but not this move, and why, so-and-so's here, but not so-and-so. And so I thought it was interesting, first of all, that Arthur Blank was the only individual sitting there. And I think it's rightly so that is the approach that the Falcons wanted to take, at least from a public ops perspective, that he is kind of there leading the charge. But I also thought that what he had to say, I just didn't really feel like he was dancing around too many things, even though he may have downplayed some aspects of some things. I think that the only reason he's downplaying them is because that's probably what he actually thinks, or he's saying what is actually true. And I thought that, speaking of things that were actually true as it relates to, why Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot were fired. I believe I'm going to quote Mark Raimondi, kind of had the quote, and this is not a technical quote, he's paraphrasing here, but Arthur Blank said, I didn't think that those two gentlemen, as good as people as they are, they were not providing the kind of leadership required to get us to the next level. And ultimately, when it comes down to both of them, it felt to me like the overall takeaways from the Terry Fontenot regime was a bit of a lack of vision, or a vision that was just not quite clear and being executed from the top down. Now, I think that there's perhaps a criticism that could be levied saying, well, this is a structural problem. And, Terry Fontenot didn't have all the power that he wanted to be able to kind of implement a vision from the top down because of the way that it was set up, the way that he had to work alongside other people. Of course, as we've explained before in one of the previous episodes, that the head coach and the GM are kind of on the same rung of the organization, that both report directly to someone else. That's always been the case. It will continue to be the case. That position, though, has just changed. But, ultimately, I thought it was pretty sharp words from Arthur Blank. And I think probably some things that Falcons fans will be happy to hear, which is him kind of saying, like, good is the enemy of great, and we can't, rest on our laurel. Not even rest on our laurels. He did not say that, but he said, like, we have another level we want to get to, and we're not getting to that level. And judging by the fact that they were fired, I think Arthur Blank thinks that they should be at that level. They should be at a higher level, obviously, than what they were at this season, which is probably flattering, considering the fact that the Falcons won those last 4 games, won on that winning run, where it felt like at times this season it was way worse, frankly, than what we were watching last year, despite some of the positives that came out of this season, especially with the defense. And by the way, on the defense, Arthur Blank did intimate that he would strongly suggest that the next head coach consider keeping Jeff Ulbrich. So that's our first little hint that the organization likes Ulbrich, wants Ulbrich to stay. Ultimately, it's not going to be Arthur Blank's call or anyone in the organization's call outside of the head coach and the president of football and the GM. But I think that is encouraging that the team will be kind of thinking that way when they go into some of these head coaching interviews, which are starting to take place and will continue to take place here over the next several weeks. Now, let's get into the main portion, or the main kind of thing that we learned from this press conference was about this new president of football position. First of all, and one of the things that Arthur Blank kind of was forceful about at the top with regards to this new position is that the title of the position is president of football, not president of football operations, which is basically a term that I think a lot of journalists have started running with. I don't believe it was ever phrased that way by the Falcons themselves, but because that is a common title that you see in maybe less in the NFL specifically, but obviously in basketball, you have basketball operations people. That term, just adding the operations onto the end of it, has kind of just been added by a lot of people just to, I think, sound correct. But that is not correct. It is the president of football. And the reason why it's worth delineating this small difference is because I think that operations word in the title lends itself to a role that is particularly administrative. Like you're filing a lot of paperwork, you're doing a lot of things behind the scenes, you're taking care of problems. But a president of football without the operations attached is more of a visionary, a culture setter, and making sure obviously that things are executing there. But he's really like a football czar. He's basically the in charge of football. He's the president of football. He is he has responsibility and oversees everything that happens on the sporting side. And then you have Greg Beatles, who we mentioned earlier, who's kind of on the other side. He's on the non-sporting side of the organization. He is one of the ones who is doing a lot of those administrative tasks that are required to run, obviously, a very complex organization that an NFL team is. But, I think that the way that Arthur Blank described this president of football role took off the plate some of the things that were criticisms toward the potential hiring of Matt Ryan of he doesn't have experience doing this. He doesn't have experience working in an Excel sheet and looking at finances for such and such. Like he doesn't have some of these, like whatever those things are that he does not have experience in, because we know that his experience is primarily on the football field. And, I think that, and or Charles Odom later from the AP later asked, well, when you're interviewing these candidates for the president of football, what would you think about a potential candidate who didn't have the traditional experience that someone with this in this role would have? And Arthur Blank just said, I believe that you're asking about Matt Ryan, this question, which obviously was true. And yeah, like I think that that is where this is leading. Obviously, they're going to do their due diligence and talk to all these people, which starts today. By the way, the interviews for that position began immediately after the press conference ended. In fact, I believe I saw one of the candidates potentially walking in. I don't know these people. These are executives. These are people in suits. So I don't know who it was, but I because we were told they were literally like they had to cut the press conference because they had scheduled interviews that were ready to begin. So I believe them when they say that. And but I think that ultimately that role, continues to point toward the direction of Matt Ryan, which it basically has since the reporting on this all began. But I thought it was worth kind of going into exactly what the role, first of all, is titled, but then what that title then conveys to what the role means. And I think that we will continue once that person is hired and we can, hear more about the kinds of conversations that that person named Matt Ryan will have had with Arthur Blank. About the role, et cetera, et cetera. We'll continue to learn more, but I thought that Arthur Blank kind of laid the foundation for what that role will be, and he will oversee the GM and head coach. And I thought it was interesting that Arthur said that we can't hire the GM that we want, who is really successful and competent, and a head coach the same, if they have to just like cede all their authority to this person above them. And that's one of the reasons why, they don't want that football czar to necessarily be controlling everything. They want, the head coach to have agency. They want the GM to have agency. The GM, without saying it as clearly as about to say it, Arthur Blank basically said that the GM will be the one who's making the draft picks. The GM will be the one who is managing the salary cap. The GM will be the one who is putting together the scouting department, running the scouting department, reviewing, analyzing that end of it. The head coach, he's going to be picking his coaches. He's going to be, putting the practices, the training regimes together, the strength and conditioning, all that stuff. Like they will have their own authority to impact the football, and then in the future, Matt Ryan, when he is in position as the president of football, I'm joking here, but the odds are very high that he will hold that role. He's basically just going to kind of oversee it and give his input, give his advice, whatever he feels is worth kind of imparting on a GM or a head coach. I would imagine that it's going to be more kind of on the coaching side. I could be wrong, but and I think that establishing a culture that he thinks needs to be represented by the players and the personnel inside that building is also going to be kind of part of his remit, although that was less discussed. But, when it comes to this Falcons search for these top positions, they're going to want to go out. The GM that they're finding is not going to be like an assistant to Matt Ryan. The GM is going to be the GM, and obviously the head coach is going to be the head coach. So it's worth just kind of drilling down into that and kind of getting that in everybody's heads. And I think that is the proper way, by the way, to go about what they're embarking on with this new role here. Let's see, what else was discussed? We did hear a little bit about Rich McKay, and this is probably the one that's going to disappoint people, because I feel like, and we've talked about this again on one of the previous episodes, that Rich McKay is this boogeyman, and he's kind of the cause of a lot of the problems that have happened with the Falcons, especially in recent years, and that's just not the case. And what Arthur Blank said was that, the report that Sportology put together for them did not suggest that Rich McKay was a big problem with the organization at all. Now, he will be further removed from whatever duties he previously had left over from that 2023 press conference where we then were told he was out of football, but he will still co-chair the competition committee, which kind of definitionally means he will have some involvement with the Falcons. Don't know if he will continue to participate in these Monday meetings with the head coach. I think that that's probably something the president of football will offer his advice on about like how those meetings should go down. I assume that Arthur Blank will want to continue having the meetings. He wants to know what's up with his football team, and he's well within his rights to have those meetings. Like we said earlier, or on some of these previous shows, though, Rich McKay, the reason why he was in on those meetings is so that he could be a liaison from the club to the broader league to elevate concerns, questions, issues, that kind of thing. And obviously every team has an ability to do this without having their own Rich McKay. But Rich McKay's prominent role in the competition committee gives a little bit of a priority status, or kind of just like a nice status for the Falcons to be able to kind of elevate some of that stuff up to. We also heard Arthur Blank talk about Michael Penix and the quarterback situation. He said without saying it, but what I took away is that Kirk Cousins will not be back as the team's quarterback, and Blank, reaffirmed Michael Penix as the team's quote unquote franchise quarterback. Now, I would say that these things can change quickly. They can change in a matter of games or weeks when you get into a season. So we'll see. I think it's still obviously very much an open question. I'm not surprised that Arthur Blank said that Michael Penix is still the franchise quarterback for this team. Michael Penix has played less than a full season of games, so it would be kind of crazy to say take a stance that he's not good enough basically at this point, and he's still under contract for you. You know that he's going to be getting as many games as he can, healthily start in next year. So, you're going to want to try to fill that player with confidence and support, which the team will. And I think that it's genuine. I'm not saying it's disingenuous. Like he's kind of lying through his teeth saying like, oh yeah, he's our franchise quarterback, while behind the scenes they're kind of working on other plans. But I do think that those plans can change. And, it's going to be an important year for Michael Penix because he's going to have however many games he has to play next year. He's got that many opportunities to show the Falcons that he's worth them picking up his fifth-year option, because that's when that will need to be done heading into his fourth season in the NFL. And if they don't pick up that fifth-year option, then that basically means that he's not the franchise quarterback at that point, or they're at least still not sure. So we'll see what happens there, but I'm not surprised that Arthur Blank was kind of so forceful in what he said for Michael Penix, what he said about Michael Penix being this team's quarterback. I'm looking through some of my questions that I had, and I kind of I hate that I had the second question because I didn't want to ask about the involvement of Josh Blank with the second question. I want to kind of get to the big points, just ask the big simple questions first. So don't recall him talking about Josh at all in this press conference. He was. I think he was a little bit buttoned up about what he had to say about working with the consulting group Sportology. And again, we kind of referenced it earlier with Rich McKay, but with regards to the report that they produce about, the health check or whatever it is of the Falcons, not a whole lot that he said about that, but it was clear that, coming out of all of this, that they needed a better vision, again, and that leads to this president of football that will then provide it. It just felt like with what he had to say, that's one of the reasons why they wanted to start thinking about restructuring the way that the sporting side of the organization works. Blank did mention, obviously, that they're going to want to spend time with John Harbaugh. That was major news that hit right after Mark Zinno and I got done talking when we recorded our last show earlier this week. So that's obviously going to be a huge name, obviously, and it's a super successful head coach, and that's kind of, we'll wrap it up here, kind of talking about what's going on with the coaching search. And by the way, the team is obviously conducting the GM searches as well. Everything that I'm hearing says that Ian Cunningham is kind of the guy to look for this job. So it feels like that's the way that position is going to go. I think the head coach is a lot more interesting. I think there's the possibility of a lot more different kinds of opinions that you can have on who you think would be ideal for this role the Falcons have. And John Harbaugh is going to get a ton of support from fans to potentially be the head coach. I threw up a poll, I believe sometime earlier this week, saying just like hypothetically, who would you want if you're a Falcons fan? Would you rather have Matt LaFleur, who is not available right now but could become available? There's rumors that he could be let go by the Packers if they have an early playoff exit. By the way, the Packers could be the ones who, like, if you're the Packers and you feel like you need what John Harbaugh offers, maybe the Packers could be the ones who are able to scoop up Harbaugh. But obviously, I said, would you rather have Matt LaFleur or John Harbaugh? And to me, the reason why it's an interesting question is not just because it's two high-profile coaches, but it's because it's two coaches that kind of have a different selling point to them. John Harbaugh is your CEO type. He made his way as a special teams coordinator, got a head coaching role, was involved in a really, really prolific organization when it comes to being able to draft, being able to kind of reinvent yourself, being able to resupply, because you have so many, talented players, you're inevitably going to lose some, but they've done a really good job in the draft with Ozzie Newsome and then Eric DeCosta. So just like that's what John Harbaugh brings. John Harbaugh brings that wealth of experience. I believe it was 18 years he had been in Baltimore, has gone through all of the tactical changes as a head coach that have occurred in the NFL over those years, and there's been a hell of a lot of tactical change over those 18 years. So that's what John Harbaugh brings. Matt LaFleur, on the other hand, and I would also kind of lump in a guy like Clint Kubiak, any offensive play caller basically, is more of the tactician, more of the guy who has been hands-on with a quarterback, and in this case, with Matt LaFleur specifically, been hands-on with Matt Ryan, which would obviously be a connecting point and one of the most successful seasons Matt Ryan had in his career, the most successful season Matt Ryan had in his career. So, there's obviously reasons why the team will be not just interested in Matt LaFleur, but may prefer Matt LaFleur to a John Harbaugh if it were to come to it. And I think if you're asking me, I prefer LaFleur. I might even prefer this might get me, this might make people mad. I might even prefer Clint Kubiak over John Harbaugh. And the reason is because I feel like what you're going to get from the new GM, what you're going to get from President of Football Matt Ryan, assuming that comes to task, what you're going to get from those guys hopefully is the kind of culture building CEO, whatever, CEO coach, like whatever the CEO coach, whatever that is, that makes him a CEO coach, whatever he's offering the organization that makes him that. I'm hoping that is provided by Matt Ryan in his role, is provided by, the GM to a lesser extent, I would say. But you want some of that just like professionalism and whatever it is, these CEO coaches have, that can kind of be provided elsewhere. And I kind of want my head coach to be, first of all, an offensive play caller for the stability reasons long term, so he doesn't get poached, you don't lose your offensive scheme, and you can adjust your offensive scheme as you go. And you just have that connection with the quarterback. You get a guy who's worked with a bunch of quarterbacks who obviously has a great grasp of how you want to operate between the lines on Sundays or Mondays. So that I just prefer the tactician, the offensive play caller, over the CEO type at head coach. So that one might get me in trouble with some people, but that's just what I think. I know it will get me in trouble with my dad. My dad thinks that the Ravens made a huge mistake, and I know he really wants John Harbaugh in as the Falcons coach. But certainly there are some really good candidates now. Mike McDaniel also, we just heard, that just broke while we were literally sitting in the press conference room at the Arthur Blank family offices waiting for the thing to begin. Mike McDaniel let go. Obviously, another guy who was on that same coaching staff with LaFleur for that Falcons Super Bowl run. So another guy that would have very strong connections to Matt Ryan and this Atlanta Falcons organization, that offensive play caller, ordered with some quarterbacks. So should be interesting. There's some good candidates available, and we'll see what comes of it. Thank you guys so much again for watching. Let me know in the comments section here, if you're watching on YouTube, just what you thought of the press conference. I thought it was a better showing, generally speaking, by the Falcons as an organization in this press conference as opposed to the one in 2023. So that's my opinion, but let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about this president of football. Whether you think that this is the right idea for the Falcons, and again, with all the coaches now that are candidates, who do you prefer? Who do you prefer amongst all these guys? So let me know. And if you want to catch just the audio version of this, if you're just like in the car or whatever, just search Joe Patrick on football wherever you get your podcast. I should mention that it's on the Odyssey app, but you can just get it wherever you get your podcast. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll be back later.